Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy, a conversation with Rian Satterwhite on a critical theory lens for service learning and leadership education with the International Leadership Association. ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Rian to our second conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. Welcome, Rian.
Thank you.
So to start, we'll share a little bit more about Rian. He holds a number of different professional roles. Currently, he is the director of the Holden Center for Leadership and Community Engagement at the University of Oregon and is quite connected with ILA as the immediate past chair of Leadership Education Member Interest Group. He is also a member of the team that created ILA's Leadership Education Academy. Rian holds an MEd in Leadership Education from the University of Wollongong in Australia. He also holds a graduate certificate in leadership, ethics, and character from Kennesaw State University and a BA in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Arizona. His interests include sustainability, systems and complexity theory, systems thinking, adaptive leadership, and now critical theory. Overall, he's interested in exploring ways that leadership theory and practice are changing as we increasingly recognize our place within and responsibility to natural systems. And what I love, as speaking as someone who's begun her own PhD research into things like critical theory, Rian talks about critical theory and how it comes into play as an important method for critically examining dominant paradigms and hidden assumptions in the leadership studies field. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that when we talk about Rian's article today. So to get us started, Rian, thinking back to your article, what key question or questions were you hoping to answer in writing this article?
Well, really, it was a pleasure to be invited to write this article, and it gave me an opportunity to put a little more structure to some ongoing thoughts that had been rattling around my brain. So this is maybe a little bit different of a Pause for Pedagogy entry than most submissions will be, in that what I'm talking about here, the application of critical theory to specifically our service learning programming, is a reflection on what could be and ways to potentially strengthen our existing programming. And so I have been reading more about critical theory for the last 6 to 9 months, really. So I claim no expertise, but I have been diving into it and finding a lot of inspiration from it. And I'm also really interested in how critical theory can help influence, shape, and guide leadership studies as a field. There's something called critical leadership studies, loosely called that, that's emerged out of a lot of the UK business schools, as I understand it. But beyond that, I haven't encountered a great deal of others wrestling with critical theory and leadership studies, with the notable exception of Julie Owen editing a really great journal issue that begins to ask some critical questions for leadership educators. So really what I was hoping to do with this is provide an additional prompt for readers and members of ILA to begin wrestling with, engaging, learning about critical theory, and to help all of us ask some crucial questions about some hidden assumptions in the field, maybe.
And I'm curious, now that you've talked about critical theory, and I think your last sentence maybe touched on this already, but for those of us who are hoping to immerse ourselves a little bit more in critical theory, and I know you don't claim expertise, but I think you can claim some familiarity with the topic. How might you define critical theory for someone who's looking to further?
So critical theory, as I understand it, stems from something called the Frankfurt School, which was a group of social scientists and philosophers in Europe that really emerged in the 1920s, 30s, 40s in kind of a direct dialogue with Marxism. And so I think in its modern day form. Critical theory is perhaps as critical of Marxism as any other worldview, but it certainly has that, that history to it. And so what it's interested in doing is unmasking ideology and power structures, contesting hegemonic ideas that tend to shape the way we think and perceive the world, that are in ways that are so almost so obvious that they're hidden. They're so pervasive that they go unquestioned. And so critical theory talks a lot about the practice, the real practice of democracy, about reclaiming reason, about pursuing liberation. It has a lot of history to it, and it's certainly a contested field. But I think if I were to sum it up, it's about asking critical, reflective questions about the way that we learn to perceive the world and whether or not those ways are actually beneficial to us.
There's a lot for me to take in there, but I like all of it. And I think that's something, I think in general, that's something, not just from a critical theory standpoint, but what an interesting way of thinking about our pedagogy, as it were, to pause and think about those things that you were talking about, those deeply held beliefs, assumptions, ideas that probably do inform a lot of our practice, as well as the theory that we use that informs the practice. So certainly an interesting and timely conversation I think we're having today.
Yeah, definitely. One of my primary sources for my own learning and diving into the subject has been a book called The Power of Critical Theory, Liberating Adult Learning and Teaching. So it's really found a strong home in adult education and the pedagogy and training of adult educators. But I think that there's a lot that translates effectively to leadership education.
Absolutely. So that's a nice segue, which neither of us planned, but I think works perfectly for our next question. So tell me more about the practice or pedagogy you're discussing or hoping to discuss in your article. Where did the idea or perhaps a need for this work come from?
Great. So writing this article was a challenge. I tend to struggle in confined spaces in my writing. And so what I ended up doing is looking at just one of many critical questions that could be asked from a critical theory lens around a particular service learning experience that we've facilitated here in the Holden Center for the last couple of years. I should point out that the inspiration came from, I think I referenced Julie Owen earlier, but she has an article titled Transforming Leadership Development for Significant Learning, in which she kind of translates Brookfield's work into critical questions for developing conscious leadership educators. So there's a lot more there. I encourage everyone to go find that article because it's amazing. And so I use that as a jumping off point. And what I was interested in kind of reflecting on is the ways in which our service learning experience already align with unmasking and contesting hegemonic concepts and ideas for our students, and maybe the ways that a more intentional adoption of a critical theory lens in our programming would strengthen the student experience and outcomes as well. And so the experience that I'm referencing is an alternative break that usually goes for about 10 to 11 days. We've been facilitating this particular experience for about 3 years now. We have consistent community partners on the island of Oahu that really help us connect with the local and indigenous communities there. And the overall focus of the trip is exposing our students to ways in which local community members are kind of reclaiming sustainable agricultural practices. But in the process of doing that, it necessarily connects with this long and challenging history of colonialism and cultural appropriation and other challenges that are not new to many native populations. But specifically with Hawaii, I think that there's such a dominant imagery when we think of the islands in terms of, you know, the perfect sand beaches and swaying palm trees and, you know, hula. And I really valued the experience of bringing students to that same place, but their experience is so different than I think what they're expecting. So in many ways in this article, I found that the experience already aligns with this concept of contesting hegemony. And but I also found a lot of ways that we could potentially strengthen it moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So, and you've touched on this a little bit, maybe in a broad sense, and I know this experience is a little bit different than some of the ones we've talked about, or at least that Kathy Guthrie talked about in her interview with us. That was more in a classroom setting, and there were perhaps clearer or just more well-defined learning outcomes. But it sounds like you had some outcomes in mind or ideas in mind of what you hoped, for example, this disruption for your students might look like. So I'd love if you could share a bit more about maybe what those learning outcomes were, and if you were able to assess them and whether you were successful or not in meeting those outcomes.
Yeah, what was the word you just used? Disruption. I really like that. I may start borrowing it.
Sure.
Disruption in thinking, disruption in assumptions, and creating the space for a community of critical and reflective practice to emerge in a short period of time is really the goal of any of our alternative breaks. We have domestic and international experiences that we facilitate. And we are frequently, not all trips focus on this, but frequently looking to help our students recognize the ways in which dominant cultural norms or histories have been built upon some really nasty practices and rough, if not racist, histories. And Hawaii is no different in that respect. So we facilitate regular reflections both throughout the day, but then kind of a dedicated multi-hour space every night to make some meanings of our experiences each day. And that's my opportunity really as a facilitator to prompt the students not only to recognize ways in which they've perhaps unquestionably adopted these dominant cultural narratives around Hawaii, but also to kind of stay in that critical frame of mind and begin to unearth and surface some additional dominant narratives from maybe closer to home for them that they can begin to unpack and examine a little more critically. And so it's that dialogue that is really, I think, the heart of the experience that we're going for.
So I'll ask a pedagogical question, in part because it's my job as interviewer, but also I'm curious. Reflection for me is a professional and academic area of interest as well. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to, you talked about one of my favorite things, making meaning or providing space to make meaning of experiences. Are there ways in which you do that, knowing that disruption, as we've talked about, can be uncomfortable or difficult? And how do you see yourself as a facilitator providing maybe it's safe space, brave space, or just space in general to do that in a way that allows the students to go deeper than they might initially want to or feel that they can?
Yeah, that's a critical question and something that we're always wrestling with as facilitators. A part of it is establishing the community up front. Even though these are short-term experiences, we do have pre-departure kind of educational sessions, which are both team building in nature and preparing the students from a more intellectual lens, I guess, for what they're going to be encountering on experience. But that the team building is really essential for creating a bit of that safe or brave space with one another, because frequently, just by nature of this particular program, we draw from students who are from all across campus, all majors, most academic standings, and it's we do as much as we can before departure, but it's really about the community building that happens on experience. There's something about the service learning kind of focus of these experiences, that the doing of the work, I think, that tends to also bring people closer together. And so we talk a lot about how we can value our limited impact. We're not going to be changing these communities in a 10-day span, nor should we be seeking to. But instead, we're coming in as guests and partners to be learning from them and doing the work that they choose, that they highlight as priorities for their own community. But it is, I think, the kind of the manual labor, so to speak, that tends to happen is a strong community builder and helps the group come together quickly, which directly facilitates that safer space for reflection. I think another important kind of pedagogical tool as a facilitator is to demonstrate my own reflection in the process as well. Even though I've been on this trip for 3 times now, 3 years running, I'm constantly learning and recognizing how much I don't know. And I'm very vocal about that process with the students as well, to be kind of in a co-creative space, but also to demonstrate that vulnerability that's necessary for asking some of these more critical personal questions. And I've got to say, it continually impresses me. I don't know if surprise is the right word, but it impresses me just how quickly the community can be built in these experiences, because we go deep pretty quickly in the reflection, and they're usually ready for that.
That's great. I love the idea of valuing our limited impact. I think that's going to stick with me for a little while, because I know it's something, and the limited knowledge and experience that I have in service learning, it normally attracts, again, with the students that I've seen, will change the world and are going to change the world, and it'll happen by the end of this. And I certainly see the value in, there is impact, as limited as it is, but to value the space that we have created and the opportunities that we've had, and even the impact on ourselves as well, to value that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a conversation that we have on almost every one of these experiences, especially the ones that involve flight and longer travel times, in terms of, let's take a good and honest look at the resources that have been invested in getting this group of 16 people from Oregon, across the Pacific Ocean or to other destinations. And I think the calculation has to be that it's actually not worth it if our only measure is our impact in the local communities. And so the only way to make it worth it, kind of from a cost calculation, is this longer term learning that can hopefully emerge from it, and what they choose to continue to do with that learning after the fact.
So I imagine, just listening to this, I already have a few ideas and might explore further. But thinking about where you're at right now, and knowing that you've done this trip multiple times and will again, where do you see future research or writing headed in this area for you? And what do you think you'll be writing about next?
Yeah, I'm really excited about kind of critical theory and leadership studies. I think there's a tremendous amount more that is left to be explored. There's going to be a pre-conference session focusing on critical theory and leadership at this upcoming ILA in Atlanta that I'll be participating and facilitating. I'm really excited about that. There's also a couple book projects that I know of that are in various stages of development that are beginning to wrestle with leadership and from a critical perspective. So there's a lot of people beginning to do this work, and I'm excited to see what emerges in the near future. For me, I was inspired in the writing process. I had so much to share just about this one critical reflection question around hegemony that the other areas that Owen and Brookfield and others kind of highlight as critical learning outcomes, I think I'm really interested in potentially offering up a more lengthy and complete reflection on ways in which service learning experiences can benefit from utilizing a critical theory lens. That's one of the topics that's continuing to resonate with me right now.
Mm-hmm. And we certainly recognize that Pause for Pedagogy does not necessarily allow for lengthy reflection. This is certainly a start. This is certainly a starting point, as we like to call it, for ongoing conversation, or we hope ongoing conversation. But
I hope so as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe we'll have you back for a second round interview when you've had a chance to delve a little bit deeper, because it sounds like even in the reflections that you're speaking to, there's going to be great opportunity to think about how we approach service learning or just reflection in general. I'm thinking about the work I do with students, even in areas like career services, where we ask them to reflect somewhat critically on themselves, which can be a little bit different and more difficult than reflecting on others, but there's potential wide-reaching in a lot of different areas, which is exciting.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of potential here. So I hope others join me in unearthing it. Yeah,
absolutely. So on that note, aside from perhaps plugging your exciting pre-conference at ILA, which I'll be at too, so maybe I'll try to sneak into that if I can. Is there anything else that you wanted to add or share or perhaps reflect on from our conversation today?
I think the only thought that I'd like to leave us with is that I do believe that there are some infrequently questioned assumptions, dominant norms and narratives in the leadership studies field. As hard as it is to pin down leadership definitions, that famous kind of observation around there being as many definitions as authors, as hard as it is to narrow it down, I think there are some dominant trends in the literature and in the practice in higher education of how we tend to teach students about this that could benefit from some critical examination.
Absolutely. And I think that's an excellent question to think about as we move forward in our Pause for Pedagogy series. In part, what we're hoping to do is to have that opportunity to critically reflect. And it's one thing to do that in an article and to write about something from the what perspective, but I think the so what and a little bit of the now what has also come up today. So thank you, Ryan, for that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and everyone for joining us today. Pause for Pedagogy is an initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association, ILA. Our articles and videos are available at www.ila-net.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter at @the_ILA. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you again next month for another installment of Pause for Pedagogy. Thanks again, Ryan.
Thank you.